Black student humiliated by math professor. Minutes later, he proves he's a genius. The chalk screeched against the board as Jaden Carter, standing at the front of the massive lecture hall, wrote the final answer. He set the chalk down with a steady hand and turned around to face the stunned audience. Silence. A suffocating, heavy silence filled the room, as though the air had been sucked out. Students sat frozen in their seats, some gripping their pens mid-air, their notes abandoned. A few exchanged wide-eyed glances. At the professor's desk, Dr. Linda Whitmore clenched her jaw so tightly, it looked as though she might crack a tooth. The authority she had so meticulously crafted in her classroom was slipping through her fingers like fine grains of sand. Jaden didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply folded his arms and waited. The proof on the board was flawless. It wasn't just correct, it was elegant, efficient, and miles ahead of anything Whitmore had expected. Yet, instead of acknowledging it, Whitmore took a slow breath and spoke, her voice sharp as a blade. "Lucky guess," she muttered. A ripple of whispers filled the room. A few students even let out an incredulous laugh. Jaden tilted his head, unimpressed. "I don't believe in luck," he replied calmly. Another sharp inhale from Whitmore. Her fingers tapped against her clipboard, a telltale sign of someone desperately trying to reclaim control. For the first time since she had walked into this room, the class wasn't looking at her as the authority figure. They were looking at him. 6 hours earlier, Jaden walked into Harvard University's grand mathematics lecture hall, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. The room was massive, an architectural wonder designed to make even the most confident students feel insignificant beneath its towering ceilings. Rows of students, many dressed in preppy sweaters and expensive watches, were already seated, their laptops open, formulas and notes glowing on the screens. Jaden found an empty seat in the middle, pulled out a worn notebook, and settled in. This was Advanced Calculus 3, the toughest math class on campus, taught by Dr. Linda Whitmore, a professor infamous for her brutal lectures and unwavering belief in intellectual superiority. Whitmore, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and sharp features, strode into the room with the energy of a general walking onto a battlefield. She surveyed the class with a practiced smirk, as if already deciding which students would fail spectacularly. "Good morning," she said, adjusting her glasses. "This isn't an introductory class. If you're here expecting me to coddle you through equations, leave now. I don't have time for the weak." A few nervous chuckles. Jaden simply wrote the words, "She likes control," in the corner of his notebook. She turned, grabbed a piece of chalk, and, without another word, began writing an equation so complex that half the class instantly tensed. "This," she announced, "is a problem taken directly from an advanced graduate-level course. Any of you who think you belong here should be able to at least understand the first few steps." She stepped back, crossing her arms. A long silence followed. Students stared at the equation, their minds scrambling to decipher it. A few leaned forward, whispering theories to one another. Whitmore's gaze flickered over them, her smirk widening as she noted the collective uncertainty. Then a single hand went up. The room turned. "Jaden." Whitmore's smirk twitched. "Yes?" "That equation is wrong," Jaden said simply, a sharp intake of breath from the class. Whitmore froze. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt crossed her features. But then she squared her shoulders, adjusting her glasses as if the very idea of her making a mistake was ridiculous. "Excuse me," she said coolly. Jaden leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notebook. "I'm saying that if you solve it as written, the result contradicts basic calculus principles. The transformation in the second step is incorrect." Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. The tension in the room shifted. Nobody, challenged Dr. Whitmore in her own class. "You must be mistaken," she said dismissively, turning back to the board. "I assure you, My calculations are accurate. Jaden shrugged. Okay, but if I'm wrong, the final answer should be what? Whitmore hesitated. And there it was. Jaden's keen eye caught the flicker of hesitation, the subtle way she stiffened, realizing that she had no immediate response. The class picked up on it, too. Students shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the board and their notes, realizing that maybe, just maybe, he was right. A girl sitting in the front hesitantly raised a hand. "Professor, I think he's onto something." Whitmore exhaled sharply. She wouldn't admit this in front of everyone. Instead, she turned to Jaden and smiled, a tight, rehearsed expression. "If you're so confident, Mr. Carter, why don't you prove it? Come up here and solve it yourself." A trap. She wanted to humiliate him, to make an example out of him. But Jaden, he wasn't intimidated. Without a word, he stood, walked down the steps toward the massive blackboard, took the chalk from her hand, and erased the incorrect portion of the equation. The class watched in eerie silence as Jaden's hand moved like lightning, his strokes confident, deliberate. He worked through the problem effortlessly, breaking it down, simplifying it, and reconstructing it correctly. As the final answer emerged, the room fell dead silent. Jaden set the chalk down and turned. Dr. Whitmore was frozen in place. The moment Jaden picked up the chalk, the atmosphere in the room shifted. There was an undeniable tension, an energy crackling through the air as every pair of eyes locked onto him. Some students were eager to see him fail, while others, those who had already been skeptical of Dr. Whitmore's authority, were silently rooting for him. The equation on the board was a monster, something that belonged in an advanced graduate seminar, not an undergraduate classroom. Integrals nested within summations, variables entangled in a web of logarithms, a deliberate challenge meant to overwhelm and crush him under pressure. Jaden studied it for a few moments, tapping the chalk against his fingers. Whitmore stood to the side, arms crossed, a thin smirk creeping onto her lips. This was her moment to regain control. "Take your time," she said smoothly. "Wouldn't want you to make a mistake." Jaden didn't react. Instead, he closed his eyes for a second, letting the problem settle in his mind. He wasn't just looking at numbers, he was seeing patterns, the natural rhythm of mathematics forming in his head like the chorus of a song. Then, without hesitation, he started writing. The first step came effortlessly, a clean and confident simplification of the outermost integral. A few whispers flickered through the crowd. "Wait, he's already breaking it down," someone muttered. Whitmore's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Jaden kept going, his chalk moving swiftly but with precision. Every step built on the last, flowing like a well-rehearsed performance. Where most students would hesitate, second-guessing themselves, he was already 5 steps ahead. The room grew quieter. Even the students who had been prepared to laugh at his failure were now leaning forward, watching in stunned silence as the numbers unfolded before them. By the halfway point, Jaden had already cut through the complexity, transforming the massive equation into something that looked manageable. Whitmore's fingers twitched at her sides. He was solving it too fast. Jaden took a small step back, letting the chalk hover over the final few lines. He knew he could finish it right now, but instead he glanced at Whitmore. "Do you want the solution in its simplest exponential form?" he asked casually, "or would you prefer the expanded trigonometric representation?" The air sucked out of the room. A murmur rippled through the students, followed by a low whistle from the back row. Whitmore's lips parted slightly, caught off guard. This was supposed to be her moment. This was supposed to be the point where he stumbled, fumbled, failed. Instead, he was giving her options. "Exponential," she said quickly, trying to regain control. Jaden nodded once, then boxed the final answer. Done. He turned back to the class, hands relaxed, his expression neutral. Silence. Then, Damn, someone muttered. Another student in the back gave a slow clap. Whitmore inhaled sharply, straightening her posture. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clipped. Jaden did as he was told, but not before noticing the way she gripped her pen tighter, the subtle twitch in her jaw. She had lost this round. But Jaden knew this wasn't over. After class, the whispers followed him. The moment he stepped into the hallway, a group of students had already gathered, waiting for him. "Dude, where the hell did you learn to do that?" Brian, a classmate he had barely spoken to before, asked, his face still twisted in disbelief. Jaden shrugged, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pockets. "I just see math differently." "Yeah, no kidding," another student chimed in. "That was insane. Whitmore looked like she was about to explode." Jaden gave a small, tired smile. He wasn't interested in embarrassing professors or proving a point for the sake of it. But he also wasn't going to shrink himself just to make someone else comfortable. "She's not going to let this go," Brian said, lowering his voice. "You know that, right?" Jaden knew. Whitmore had spent years crafting her reputation as one of the toughest professors in the university. She was respected, feared, and never questioned. Until today. Later that evening, inside Dr. Whitmore's office, the door shut with force, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Whitmore stood at her desk, fingers tapping impatiently against the surface. Across from her, another faculty member, Professor Robert Landon, head of the mathematics department, studied her with an unreadable expression. "You seem agitated, Linda," Landon said finally. Whitmore exhaled through her nose. "That boy, Jaden Carter." Landon raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" she scoffed. "He made a fool of me in front of my class today." Landon leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "Or maybe he's just as brilliant as they say." Whitmore's jaw tightened. She had heard the rumors before. A young black student with a mind sharper than most professors, someone who could solve problems in his head that others needed hours for. She had dismissed them. Not anymore. "This isn't about brilliance," she said, voice cold. "It's about authority. He undermined me in front of my students. If I let that go unchecked, I lose control of the room." Landon's expression darkened slightly. "You're not planning on retaliating, are you?" Whitmore's eyes flickered. "Not retaliate." A pause. "Just remind him of his place." Landon sighed, rubbing his temples. "Linda, we've had this conversation before. You can't let personal pride get in the way of actual teaching." "Pride?" Whitmore's voice sharpened. "He needs to understand that intelligence is not enough. The real world doesn't work like that. He needs discipline. He needs to be humbled." Landon studied her, then exhaled. "You mean he needs to be controlled?" Whitmore didn't respond. She didn't need to, because she had already made up her mind. Jaden Carter had embarrassed her today. She wasn't going to let him do it again. And the next time he stepped into her classroom, she would make sure he paid for it. Her arms were still crossed, but her fingers dug into her sleeves, the only betrayal of her frustration. She scanned the board, searching desperately for an error. There was none. A long, tense pause. Then, "Fine," she snapped. "You corrected a minor oversight." A few chuckles in the back. Some students exchanged smirks. Jaden's face remained unreadable. He had just done what nobody else dared to do. He had exposed her mistake. And for the first time, the power in the room shifted. Dr. Whitmore's fingers curled at her sides, her anger barely contained. She had to reclaim control. "Since you're clearly eager to show off, let's see how you handle this." She turned back to the board and began writing an equation more difficult than any undergraduate should be able to solve. Jaden's lips curved slightly. She was digging her own grave. "Go ahead, Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, stepping aside. "Solve this one." Jaden rolled his shoulders. "Gladly." As he picked up the chalk, the class leaned forward, realizing that whatever was about to happen next would change everything. Jaden walked into class the next day, feeling the weight of the previous day's events pressing down on him. The moment he stepped into the lecture hall, he could feel the shift in the air. Some students looked at him with newfound respect, others with skepticism, and a few with outright hostility. But he didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to learn. Dr. Whitmore was already at the front, writing something on the board, long, winding equations that stretched across the surface. It was different this time. Instead of the usual structured lecture, she had filled the board with a series of brutally complex problems, each one a level above what the class had been studying. Some of them even looked like they belonged in a graduate-level exam. The students exchanged uneasy glances. "What the hell is this?" Brian muttered under his breath as Jaden slid into the seat beside him. Jaden's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. Whitmore finished writing and turned to face the class, her expression cool, her hands clasped in front of her. "Today," she began, "we're going to do something a little different." There was a strange sharpness to her voice, a quiet but undeniable challenge beneath the words. "I've prepared a set of problems," she continued. "These are not easy. In fact, they are problems that most of you, if not all of you, will struggle to solve." Jaden could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just talking to the class. She was talking to him. "Some students," she went on, her gaze lingering on him for just a second too long, "have demonstrated confidence in their abilities. Today we will see if that confidence is justified." A few students shifted in their seats. They knew what was happening. She was setting a trap. She wanted to make sure that if Jaden failed even once, it would happen in the most humiliating way possible. "Each of you will have 20 minutes to solve one of these problems," she continued. "Pick the one you think you can handle, and we'll go over the solutions together." A collective groan rippled through the class. Jaden glanced at the board. She had picked these problems carefully. One of them involved an incredibly obscure theorem that most undergraduates wouldn't even be familiar with. Another relied on a trick hidden deep within the calculus of variations, something that only someone with advanced independent study would recognize. This wasn't just a test. This was war. The timer started. Pencils scratched against paper. Students hunched over their desks, flipping through notes, searching for anything that might help them. Jaden chose his problem carefully. He knew Whitmore was expecting him to fail, so he had to be perfect. As he worked, he felt the room closing in. He could hear students whispering. He could see Whitmore's gaze flicking toward him every so often, watching, waiting. And then he saw it. A mistake. Not in his own work, but in one of the problems Whitmore had written on the board. It was subtle, so subtle that most students wouldn't catch it. But he did. A tiny miscalculation in one of the expressions. His pulse spiked. He knew what this meant. If he pointed it out, he'd be challenging her again. But if he didn't, he'd be letting a false problem stand, and that wasn't something he was willing to do. Time ticked down. Jaden finished his solution, set down his pen, and leaned back in his chair. Whitmore glanced at the clock. "Time's up," she announced. "Let's go over the answers." She went through the first few problems, nodding in satisfaction as students struggled to piece together their solutions. Most of them had failed. And then she got to Jaden. "Mr. Carter," she said, "let's see if you're as confident today as you were yesterday." There were a few quiet snickers. Jaden stood. He walked to the front of the room, took the chalk, and wrote out his solution in clean, precise lines. As he finished, he set the chalk down and turned to Whitmore, meeting her gaze head-on. "It's correct," he said. A murmur rippled through the students. Whitmore studied the board, searching for any flaw she could exploit. There was none. "Acceptable," she said finally, her voice clipped. Then Jaden turned back to the board. "But there's another problem," he added. Whitmore's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Jaden picked up the chalk again and circled a section of one of the other problems. "This equation you gave us," he said calmly. "It contains an error." Silence. A few students whispered. Jaden tapped the board lightly. "Right here. You carried over the coefficient incorrectly when simplifying. It throws off the entire calculation. If anyone tried to solve it as written, they'd never get the correct result." Dead silence. Whitmore's face stiffened. She turned slowly to face the board, her lips pressing together as her eyes scanned the equation. Jaden waited. Then she saw it. A mistake. Her mistake. Her jaw tightened. A few students exchanged glances, their eyes wide. And then someone in the back let out a low whistle. "Damn," someone muttered. Jaden didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped back, meeting Whitmore's gaze. And for the first time, he saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not frustration. Doubt. After class, Jaden packed up his things and walked toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard her voice behind him. "Mr. Carter." He stopped, turning back. Whitmore stood by her desk, her face carefully neutral. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, "You caught something most students wouldn't have," she admitted. Her voice was measured, her words carefully chosen. "That doesn't happen often." Jaden said nothing. Then she added, "But don't get comfortable." His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "You may have had a good day," she said, tilting her head slightly. "But don't assume that means you've won." Jaden studied her. Then slowly he smiled. "This isn't about winning," he said simply. "It's about being right." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. And this time, she didn't stop him. The moment Jaden stepped into the lecture hall the next morning, he felt it. The tension was thicker than before. Some students gave him quick glances, their expressions ranging from impressed to skeptical. Others whispered in hushed voices, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Whitmore was already at the front of the room. She stood by the board, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the students as they filed in. But when her gaze landed on Jaden, something changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else. But he saw it. A flicker of something, annoyance, frustration, doubt. She turned back to the board. "Take your seats," she said coolly. Jaden slid into his usual chair, Brian beside him. "Dude," Brian muttered under his breath, "you really pissed her off." Jaden didn't respond. He just waited. Because he knew Whitmore wasn't done with him yet. And he was right. Whitmore picked up a thick textbook from the desk and turned to face the class. "Yesterday's discussion was enlightening," she said, her voice clipped but controlled. A few students smirked. Whitmore didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she continued, "But if we are truly going to measure intelligence, then let's push the limits." She flipped through the pages, stopping somewhere deep in the book, far beyond what they had covered. Then she turned the book around so the class could see the problem she had chosen. A low murmur rippled through the room. It was insanely difficult, a problem packed with integrals, differentials, and hidden complexities that even graduate students would struggle with. Jaden's eyes narrowed. He already knew this wasn't for the class. This was for him. "Let's see who's truly capable," Whitmore said. "Solve this." Silence. No one moved. Students exchanged nervous glances. One guy in the front row, Sam, an honor student who had always prided himself on his math skills, picked up his pen, hesitated, then slowly set it down. He wasn't even going to try. Whitmore tapped her fingers on the desk. "Mr. Carter," she said suddenly, her voice too casual. Jaden knew what was coming. "Would you care to give it a shot?" More whispers. Jaden exhaled. Of course she was doing this. She wanted to see if yesterday had been a fluke. She wanted him to crack in front of everyone, to stumble, to second-guess himself. Because if he failed here, she could take back control of the class. Brian leaned over. "Dude, this is a setup," he whispered. Jaden knew that too, but he wasn't about to back down. So he stood. The room held its breath as he walked to the board. Whitmore handed him the chalk. And then he started. At first, the only sound was the soft scratch of chalk against the board. Jaden moved with calm precision, breaking the equation down step by step. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. Because while the problem was tough, he saw the solution. Somewhere behind him, a student whispered, "Is he actually solving it?" Another murmured, "No way." Jaden's hands worked fast, his mind moving even faster. Every symbol, every number flowed together seamlessly. Whitmore's posture tightened. She had expected him to struggle, but he wasn't struggling. He was excelling, faster than she, or anyone else, had thought possible. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Jaden boxed his final answer and set the chalk down. Silence. Then, "Wait," Whitmore said, stepping forward. She scanned his work, her eyes darting from line to line, looking for an error, something, anything, that she could use against him. But there was nothing. It was flawless. A few students started whispering. One girl, Rachel, turned to Brian and muttered, "Okay, that was actually insane." Brian just shook his head. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Interesting," she said finally. But Jaden wasn't finished, because he had noticed something else. "Professor Whitmore," he said, his voice calm. She turned, her expression unreadable. "You picked this problem carefully," he continued. "It's difficult, but the way it was written, there was a flaw." The murmurs grew louder. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Jaden turned back to the board, circled a specific part of the equation. "This step here, it was structured to seem like a dead end," he explained, "but there's a trick to solving it. A shortcut. If someone didn't see that, they'd spend hours stuck in a loop." He looked back at her. "You knew that, didn't you?" Whitmore's grip tightened on the edge of her desk. Because he was right. She had chosen this problem not just to test him, but to try and trap him. And yet, he had seen through it. A few students gasped. One guy in the back whispered, "Holy crap, he just called her out." Jaden didn't move. He just waited. And then, Whitmore did something no one expected. She laughed. Not a warm laugh, not amused. A sharp, knowing laugh. "You're sharp," she admitted. "I'll give you that." Some students exhaled in relief, as if she was finally going to accept that Jaden was the real deal. But then she smiled, and Jaden knew. This wasn't over. "You handled that problem well," she said, "but let's see how you do under pressure." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. Then she lifted it slightly, just enough for him to see the name on the cover. The statewide mathematics competition. Jaden's pulse jumped. Some students gasped. Brian's mouth dropped open. Whitmore held his gaze. "If you're as good as you think you are," she said, "you'll prove it here." She placed the folder on the desk. "You have 1 week to decide." Silence. Every eye in the room was on Jaden. They knew what she was doing. She was raising the stakes, daring him to step into the spotlight, and if he did, he had to win. Jaden's hands curled into fists at his sides, because now it wasn't just about him. It was about every student who had ever been underestimated. It was about proving, once and for all, that he belonged. He met Whitmore's gaze, and then he nodded. "I'm in." The decision was made. Jaden was in. But the real challenge had just begun. The statewide mathematics competition wasn't some high school quiz bowl. It was an elite tournament where only the best of the best competed. These were students from Ivy League feeder schools, math prodigies who had been training for years, and now he was stepping into their world. Jaden sat in the library that night, his notebook open, equations scrawled across the page. But he wasn't just solving problems. He was studying patterns, looking for ways to streamline his calculations. Across from him, Brian leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "This is insane, man. You know how tough this competition is, right?" Jaden tapped his pen against the table. "Yeah." Brian studied him. "Then why are you so calm?" Jaden exhaled. "Because I have to be." Brian scoffed. "You don't have to do this. Whitmore wants you to crack. She's testing you." "I know," Jaden admitted. "But if I back down, what does that say?" Brian was quiet for a moment. Then, with a sigh, he leaned forward. "All right," he said. "If you're doing this, then we're doing this." Jaden raised a brow. Brian smirked. "You think I'm letting you take on the biggest math showdown of the year alone?" Jaden couldn't help but chuckle. "Appreciate it." Brian grinned. "Let's get to work." For the next 7 days, Jaden lived and breathed math. Every spare moment was spent training. Every break between classes, he was running through advanced theorems. Every night, he was solving brutal problem sets under strict time limits. Even Brian, who had originally just planned to help, found himself dragged into the madness. At one point, he groaned, slamming his book shut. "Dude, my brain is actually melting." Jaden smirked. "That's how you know it's working." Brian grumbled something under his breath, but didn't stop. The thing was, this wasn't just about Jaden anymore. Word had gotten out. Students across campus were now watching. Some were rooting for him. Some were waiting for him to fail. And Whitmore. She hadn't said much since the challenge was issued. But Jaden knew she was watching too. Waiting. Testing him. And he would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. The night before the competition, Jaden sat alone in the library. Brian had crashed hours ago, unable to keep up with Jaden's relentless pace. Now it was just him. One last set of problems, one last push. But as he stared at the numbers in front of him, his mind wasn't clicking the way it usually did. He was tired. Exhausted, actually. His vision blurred slightly as he forced himself to focus. The numbers, they weren't aligning the way they should. He shook his head, trying to rework the equation. No good. For the first time in weeks, he felt doubt creeping in. What if Whitmore was right? What if he wasn't ready? What if... A hand slammed down on the table. Jaden jumped. He looked up. Brian stood over him, arms crossed, an unimpressed look on his face. "Dude," Brian said, "go to sleep." Jaden blinked. "I'm fine," Brian scoffed. "No, you're fried. You've been running on fumes for days. You keep pushing like this and you'll burn out right before the competition." Jaden opened his mouth to argue. Brian cut him off. "Shut up and listen," he said. "You've got this. We know you've got this. But if you don't take a break, your brain is going to short-circuit at the worst possible moment." Jaden hesitated. Then, finally, he sighed. "Fine," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Brian smirked. "That's what I thought. Now get out of here." Jaden packed up his books, leaving the last problem unsolved. Tomorrow he would finish what he started. The next morning, Jaden stood in front of the competition hall. It was massive. Inside, some of the best mathematical minds in the country were already taking their seats. Jaden could feel their eyes on him as he walked in. Some looked curious, some looked doubtful. One competitor, a tall guy in a blazer with MIT's logo embroidered on the sleeve, smirked. Jaden knew that look. It was the same look Whitmore had given him before. "Prove you belong here." Jaden just smiled back, because that was exactly what he was about to do. As he took his seat, the announcer stepped up to the podium. Welcome, competitors, to the statewide mathematics championship, the man said. You are about to be tested on speed, accuracy, and problem-solving ability under pressure. A hush fell over the room. The first round was about to begin. Jaden closed his eyes, taking one slow breath. When he opened them, everything else faded away. Because the next time he stood up, he was going to make damn sure the world knew his name. The competition hall fell into an eerie silence as the first round began. A massive digital timer at the front of the room counted down from 10 minutes, signaling the start of the speed round. Jaden sat at his desk, fingers lightly tapping against his pen. Across the room, competitors hunched over their answer sheets, scribbling furiously. He took a deep breath. Focus. The first problem appeared on the large screen, an integral equation designed to test both speed and accuracy. Jaden's eyes flicked over it once. Done. He didn't need to write out the steps. His brain worked faster than his hands ever could. He punched in the answer on his response tablet and moved on. Second problem. A system of linear equations with 3 variables. Too easy. The clock ticked down. The competition room was filled with frantic scratching of pens against paper. Jaden was ahead of them. One by one, the answers filled his screen. His movements were calculated, efficient. He barely noticed the murmurs rising as the leaderboard updated in real time. His name was climbing. Fast. And Whitmore was watching. Seated among the faculty in the observation section, she kept her expression neutral. But Jaden could see it, the tightening of her lips, the subtle shift in her posture. She had expected him to struggle. Instead, he was dominating. By the end of the speed round, the scoreboard was clear. First place, Jaden Carter. His score was flawless. The announcer's voice broke through the tension. Congratulations to our top contenders moving into the next round. But remember, this was only the beginning. Jaden leaned back in his chair, stretching his fingers. He could feel the eyes on him. Some competitors looked impressed, others not so much. He didn't have time to dwell on it. The next challenge was up. Conceptual proofs. These were the problems that separated good competitors from the true elites. Unlike the speed round, it wasn't about who could solve equations the fastest. It was about who could think beyond the obvious. A problem appeared on the screen. Prove that a given infinite series converged to a defined limit using epsilon-delta logic. Jaden rolled his shoulders. Easy. He picked up his pen, but before he could write, someone cleared their throat loudly. A deep voice from across the room. He glanced up. It was the MIT student from earlier, the one who had smirked at him before the competition began. Now he was staring directly at Jaden, tapping his pen against the desk. His name tag read Nathan Calloway, and he had the second highest score from the first round. "You seem real confident back there," Nathan said, loud enough for the room to hear. A few people chuckled. Jaden met his gaze. "Shouldn't I be?" Nathan smirked. "We'll see." Jaden let out a quiet breath. He could already tell this guy wasn't just a competitor. He was a problem. And sure enough, as the conceptual proofs round began, Nathan made his move. This round wasn't just about solving the problems, it was about explaining them. Competitors had to show their work and, if necessary, defend it verbally. Jaden wrote out his solution with calm precision. His handwriting wasn't perfect, but his logic was unshakable. He boxed his final answer, then leaned back, waiting. But just as the judges scanned the room, Nathan raised a hand. "I'd like to challenge Carter's solution." A ripple of interest spread through the room. Jaden's jaw tightened. "Here we go." One of the judges looked intrigued. "Proceed." Nathan stood, walking over to the presentation board. His movements were smooth, practiced. He had done this before. "With all due respect," Nathan said, turning to the judges, "Jaden's proof is missing a crucial justification step. His conclusion is correct, sure, but he skipped part of the epsilon-delta argument. Jaden's eyes narrowed. That was a lie. Nathan wasn't pointing out an actual flaw. He was twisting the situation, trying to make Jaden look careless. It was exactly the kind of move Whitmore would have pulled. The judge turned to Jaden. "Carter, do you have a response?" Jaden exhaled through his nose. "Yeah." He stood up, walking over to where Nathan had underlined the so-called missing step. Cool. Controlled. "You're assuming I skipped it," Jaden said. "I didn't. I condensed it because this is a direct proof. The logic follows without needing a redundant breakdown." Nathan's smirk wavered. "Still, if someone were following your work, they might get lost." Jaden tilted his head. "If someone doesn't understand why this step is implied, then they probably shouldn't be in this competition." A few gasps. Nathan's smirk vanished completely. The judge stepped in. "Carter's proof is valid as written." Nathan sat down, his jaw tight. "Jaden." He returned to his seat like nothing had happened, but inside he knew Nathan wasn't finished, and neither was Whitmore. The final round was approaching. It was time for the ultimate challenge. Jaden had spent years proving himself in classrooms, in competitions, in every space where people doubted him. But now he wasn't just here to prove something. He was here to win. The competition hall was charged with a tense energy as the final round was about to begin. Every competitor who had made it this far was a top-tier mathematician, but now there were only two names that mattered: Jaden Carter and Nathan Calloway. The judges had deliberately chosen a problem that would test every ounce of their skill. It wasn't just about solving equations anymore. It was about creativity, strategy, and who could see beyond the numbers. The screen at the front of the hall lit up. Final problem. Prove or disprove the given conjecture using advanced calculus and abstract algebra. Jaden exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the problem. It was brutal, the kind of challenge meant to push them to the absolute limit. He reached for his pen. Across the room, Nathan cracked his knuckles and smirked. It was time. Jaden's mind went to work instantly. He had spent his entire life seeing math differently than others. Not just as numbers on a page, but as patterns, as movement, as a language that made sense when everything else in the world didn't. He started writing. Nathan did too. The room was silent except for the frantic scribbling of pens against paper. Every competitor had their heads down, lost in their own calculations. Jaden worked with calm precision. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't hesitating either. Each step in his proof led directly to the next, unfolding like a sequence of dominoes falling into place. Halfway through, he glanced at Nathan. The MIT student's face was tight with concentration, his pen moving almost as fast as Jaden's. But something was off. Nathan was speeding through, but Jaden could tell. He wasn't actually solving it. He was mimicking a proof he had seen before, trying to force the problem into a framework that didn't fit. Jaden's lips pressed together. That was going to cost him. He turned back to his own work. He saw the solution. Not just the numbers, but the underlying truth of the problem. A shortcut that no one else would notice. His pulse steadied. His pen moved faster. As the timer ticked down, murmurs rippled through the audience. Professors and graduate students watching from the observation section were leaning forward in their seats. Nathan was still grinding through the proof, filling up his page with long, exhaustive calculations. Jaden? He was nearly done. Then, he boxed his final answer, a full 30 seconds before the timer ran out. Nathan was still writing. The clock hit 0. "Time's up," the judge announced. "Pens down." Nathan froze mid-equation, his eyes flicking to Jaden's finished work. For the first time all day, uncertainty flickered across his face. Jaden leaned back, setting his pen down. Now it was up to the judges. The next 5 minutes were agonizing. The judges went over both solutions, their expressions unreadable. Nathan sat completely still, tapping his foot against the floor. Jaden, however, kept his breathing slow, steady. Finally, the head judge stood up. His eyes moved between both competitors before he spoke. "We have reviewed both solutions," he said, "and we have determined that only one of them is correct." A pause. Jaden didn't blink. "The winner of the University Mathematics Symposium is—" The judge turned to face him directly. "Jaden Carter." A split second of silence. Then, applause erupted across the room. Jaden exhaled, feeling the tension release from his chest. "Nathan?" He stared at the board, unblinking. His face twisted as he frantically scanned his work, searching for what went wrong. He wasn't going to find it, because he had been wrong from the start. Jaden stood as people congratulated him, some shaking his hand, others just giving him nods of respect. Nathan, however, wasn't done. He shot up from his seat. "This isn't possible," he said, turning to the judges. "My proof follows the established methods exactly. There's no way I made a mistake." The judge gave him a calm, unimpressed look. "You relied on a proof structure that doesn't actually apply to this problem. You forced a solution instead of seeing the correct approach." Nathan's face burned red. "Jaden?" He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply said, "You didn't lose because you weren't smart. You lost because you tried to look smart." Nathan's jaw clenched, but he had nothing left to say. Whitmore had been silent the entire time. She sat among the professors in the audience, her fingers steepled together, expression unreadable. Jaden met her gaze. For the first time in her entire career, she had been proven wrong in front of everyone. She had underestimated him, doubted him, tried to break him. And now, he was the one standing victorious. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, she gave the slightest nod, a quiet acknowledgement. Jaden didn't need her approval. He never had. But now she had no choice but to respect him. As he stepped away from the competition floor, Brian clapped a hand on his back, grinning. "Dude," he said, "you just shut them all up." Jaden chuckled, shaking his head. "I wasn't trying to," he said. Brian smirked. "Yeah, that's what makes it even better." And as they walked out of the auditorium, Jaden knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was setting over the University of Chicago, casting long golden streaks across the campus. Students bustled about, conversations filled the air, but Jaden Carter walked through the courtyard with a quiet confidence. Everything had changed. The whispers in the halls weren't about doubt anymore. They were about respect. The student who had once been dismissed, underestimated, and outright challenged in front of an entire class had proven himself beyond a shadow of a doubt. He wasn't just good, he was brilliant. And now, everyone knew it. Jaden walked into Professor Whitmore's lecture hall for the first time since the competition. As he stepped inside, the entire class turned to look at him. Some students gave him nods of acknowledgement. A few even smiled. Brian smirked from his seat near the back. "You back for more?" he whispered as Jaden slid into his usual chair. Jaden chuckled. "Nah, just finishing what I started." The door swung open and Professor Whitmore strode in. As always, her presence commanded silence. But this time, her gaze didn't just sweep over Jaden. It stopped on him. A pause. Then she walked to the front of the room, placing her notes down before addressing the class. "Before we begin," she said, her voice as sharp and authoritative as ever, "I'd like to acknowledge something." A few students exchanged glances. Whitmore never acknowledged anything except her own brilliance. Her eyes locked onto Jaden. "A week ago," she continued, "one of our students competed against the best mathematical minds in the country and won. Jaden Carter proved not only his skill, but his ability to perform under pressure at the highest level. Jaden sat still, watching her carefully. "For that," she said, "he deserves recognition." For a moment the room was completely silent. Then applause. Not hesitant, genuine. Even students who had once doubted him clapped. Brian grinned and nudged his shoulder. "Look at you, man. You got a standing ovation in Whitmore's class. That's gotta be a first." Jaden simply exhaled, nodding. He didn't need validation. He had already won. But there was something satisfying about hearing the acknowledgement out loud. After class, Jaden was the last to leave. As he reached the door, Whitmore spoke behind him. "Carter." He turned. She was standing by the desk, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You embarrassed me," she said bluntly. Jaden raised an eyebrow. "Not my intention." She smirked slightly. "I know. That's what makes it worse." A pause. Then her smirk faded, replaced by something far more serious. "I was wrong about you." Jaden studied her. Whitmore wasn't the type to apologize. She wasn't the type to admit mistakes. But this was close enough. "Guess we both learned something," Jaden said. She nodded. For a brief second, the weight of the past few weeks settled between them. Then Whitmore grabbed her notes and turned away. "Don't get cocky," she added as she walked toward her office. Jaden smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." That night, Jaden sat in the library, staring at a blank notebook. Not because he didn't know what to write, but because for the first time in a long time, the future felt open. Winning the competition was huge. But what came next? His entire life he had been told where his limits were. Now, there were none. He tapped his pen against the page. Then, slowly, he started to write. Not just equations, not just proofs, but ideas. Because for the first time ever, the world was finally listening. And Jaden Carter, he was just getting started. What would you have done in Jaden's situation? Have you ever been underestimated and proven people wrong? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.